that's a Santa Clara team that, because they have two guys who can light it up, are always dangerous. I still don't know if any of them are going to get by St. Mary's or Gonzaga, because they still have, and that's always the challenge in the league, and you know this. If you don't have to beat one of them, you have to beat both of them. And doing that in back-to-back days is a tough task for anybody. How's it going, everyone? And welcome back for another episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I'm Zach Farmer. And for those of you who are watching on video, you will notice that my background is a bit different than it normally is. That is because I'm actually on a work trip, so I'm recording this on a little bit of some downtime. I'm already in Las Vegas. I will be heading back to the Bay Area before returning for the WCC tournament. As proof, here is my hotel room key, which is for Gordon Ramsay's Burger. I have been there before. Burgers were a little actually inconsistent last time I was there. Get on that, Gordon. Get that consistency there. And then also, at one of the Cedars hotels, so there is my little bottle of water from the sports book. So just a little bit of proof that I am already prepping for Vegas for the WCC tournament. And obviously I'm going to come into this one a little bit on the disappointed side for my St. Mary's Gales, because they were unable to finish off the job and have the outright WCC championship. They were still able to get a share of the WCC regular season championship, which is still a great accomplishment. This is still the first time that they've been able to do it since 2018. Gonzaga played really well on Saturday night. Can't take anything away from the Zags. Anton Watson had a great, great game. You had some really key moments from Hunter Salas. You got Drew Timme was great in this game. He got into a little foul trouble late, but it really didn't make that much of a difference in the outcome. On the St. Mary's side, it was almost looked very similar to how the first game went. The only difference was Logan Johnson had continued his incredibly hot streak that he's had over the last few weeks. Obviously, going in, he was averaging almost 25 points a game. He had 27 more against Gonzaga on Saturdays. So we'll talk about all of that, get into that. We're also going to talk, we have to start talking about the WCC tournament itself and where the seedings are, what we're looking at, because we are set. The scene for Vegas is now set. We know who the matchups are. We know where everyone has landed. So let's paint the picture for what we're going to see. So after Gonzaga's win over St. Mary's, yes, that did put them into a tie for the share of the regular season championship. However, for the 1 seed, it is still St. Mary's. As we talked about, the tiebreaker going in was going to be the net if they ended up tying each other. St. Mary's stuck at 7, and Gonzaga ended up at 9. So that was literally the difference. So both teams will not play until the Monday night. St. Mary's will have the 6 o'clock game, and then Gonzaga will have the 8:30 nightcap. Your 3-4, Santa Clara, we already knew was locked in at 3, and your 4 seed is LMU. The Lions were able to lock it up. They put the clamps on Pepperdine down the stretch. Cam Shelton had another great game, so they did not limp their way into 4th place. They finished strong in WCC play, so I think that's going to play well going into Vegas. 5-6, your autos to the second round of the WCC tournament. 5 seed BYU after beating USF on Saturday, and then the 6 seed is USF. Both hold tiebreakers over Pacific. All 3 teams did finish it with the same record of 7-9. But BYU held the tiebreakers over both teams. USF held the tiebreaker over Pacific. So 5, 6, 7, BYU, USF, Pacific. And then, as I kind of already pointed out, Pacific is the 7 seed, followed by Portland at 8, San Diego 9, and Pepperdine 10. And those 4 teams will play in the first round on Thursday. And the first 2 matchups of that will be Pacific against Pepperdine, and then Portland against San Diego. And so looking at those two games, looking at what we're going to see, looking at the bracket, the way it's playing out, honestly, if you actually kind of take a look at the way this is all playing out, the way the tournament breaks down, that your winner of the 7-10 will end up playing your winner of the 7-10 will end up playing the 6 seed. The winner of 8-9 will play the 5 seed, and so on, so on. If you actually look at the bracket, the stronger side, honestly, is the side with the 1 seed. There's a potential, if you look at the other matchups, that both BYU and LMU sit on the St. Mary's side of the bracket. And those are two teams who have played, obviously, St. Mary's really well. Not to say that both of them have not played Gonzaga well, because they have. But we also saw what Gonzaga did in round 2 against LMU. It's kind of interesting that almost like that the fact that St. Mary's got the 1 seed almost made it a harder side of the bracket for them than if they had been the 2. And because of how tough and close we have seen St. Mary's play BYU, and then in both games, in Moraga and in Provo, even though in the St. Mary's game the BYU St. Mary's game in Provo, in Moraga, the Gales pulled away late, but they stuck with them for most of the game. And then, of course, the same you could talk about for the LMU game, which is obviously the last time they saw the Lions is when LMU beat them down in LA. So it's kind of funny, like on the surface, it feels like that's the harder side. It's the more dangerous side. But maybe the more consistent side, the one that the team that has been the most consistent over the last few weeks has been Santa Clara as the 3 seed. They won again on Saturday night. They won again on Thursday. They have continued their winning streak. They're going in strong into the WCC tournament. They're 23-8 right now. They're actually building some momentum. I'm not going to say like they have that they have a good shot at winning the WCC tournament, but it's not going to surprise me if they put a scare into Gonzaga. If they do win their quarterfinal game, then go to the semis against Gonzaga, it won't surprise me to actually see them do really well. I think we saw Brandon Pajemski not do well in the second game against the Zags, and I would anticipate that a player like him is going to make the adjustments, that he's going to play a better game. Carlos Stewart, I think, is also going to be a factor in that. Now, the one thing in that matchup, if that is the matchup that ends up happening, I still don't know if the Broncos can really hold up against this Santa Clara team because of their post play. Anton Watson has been playing so well these last few weeks. Drew Timme has turned into Drew Timme again. And those are the two that scare me more for the matchup with Santa Clara if I'm a Santa Clara fan than what obviously the guards are going to bring. Because the other factor in that is I haven't even talked about Julian Strother. And what we have seen in the past is that when he struggles in games like he did on Saturday against St. Mary's, he typically does come out pretty well the next game. So again, the next time Santa Clara will play will be in the semifinal. Next time Gonzaga plays, will be in the semifinals against the Santa Clara side of the bracket, and so I do think Strother's going to have a good game in that one, no matter who it is. But if I'm Santa Clara, that's almost like the most dangerous part of this scenario is figuring out how to slow down Julian Strother, because he is the X factor when it comes to Gonzaga. He makes or breaks how good they can be. When he is good, they are near unbeatable. When he is average, they can be gotten. They can be beat. And thinking about just the way this always feels, we know that going into the Orleans Arena, going into Vegas, that this is Spokane South. this is going to be 80% Gonzaga crowd. I do expect there to be a fairly decent St. Mary's crowd. I don't know actually what to expect from a BYU crowd this time around. It is the final time that they will be playing in this arena as part of the WCC. It will be the final time as part of this tournament. And there aren't high expectations for this team. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if they were one and done in this. Again, like, they're on that 5 side, and okay, I don't expect Portland or San Diego to knock them off. They've actually played really well against those two teams. But I don't expect them to get much further. I don't expect BYU to make a run. I think that they'll probably get one win and then they'll be done in the quarters. I think that's what I see for BYU. And I'm going to go into a little bit more about like each of these matches, because like I feel like that there's a chance that some of these, is there a team that can make a run? I go back and forth on it. Like, is there the surprise team? Like, I don't know if Santa Clara is really a surprise. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, they're good. That's not a team that would surprise, unless we're saying that anybody outside of those two teams, Gonzaga, St. Mary's, is a surprise. We haven't seen anybody do that, make a real run at the WCC championship. That was not an expected team to make a run since 2008 when San Diego did it. I don't see it. It's hard. It's hard to think about who could be that other team. And maybe there isn't another team. Maybe that's not something that's in the cards. But I will say this. I do think we're going to see a lot of really, really great individual performances in this tournament. Now, one of the things I know is that once we get to this time of the year, we have a lot of people who are going to jump back on board and be back into the mix of things. And so I want to provide some re-education about where we are with some of these teams and field some questions on like what people should actually know going into the WCC tournament for someone who may not have been following it the whole time or may not be as closely following it as some of the diehards like myself have done throughout the course of the year. So I'm actually going to bring on my very own wife, Linda, to talk about what some of her questions are going into this tournament, and from the more casual fan, what are the questions you want to know? Okay, so as I mentioned before, I'm bringing in my very own wife, Linda, to be able to talk about the WCC tournament, and for someone who does, because she is someone who doesn't follow it as close, even though like I'm right next to her and saying all of these things, all the stats and everything else, she's sometimes listening. So, Linda, so what do you want to know about the WCC tournament? What are some of the questions that you have as someone who is, while paying attention, not as closely as some of the diehards?
Well, I think the most interesting has been how folks in the middle of the conference have been like so close together. They've just kind of been leapfrogging and back and forth. And so I'm wondering which team you think is going to have like the greatest potential to make a run for it.
Yeah, and as I was recording some of it earlier, I was talking about like I don't know if like there's the one team who like I think is actually going to do it, but if I'm thinking about the teams who have the chance, who really could do it, I think you have to start with LMU because they did something that no one else has been able to do. They beat Gonzaga, St. Mary's, and BYU in the same year. No one has done that before, and we know that Cam Shelton, their their star guard is just so dangerous that he can take over a game late. And so you can't overlook what LMU is capable of. You can't overlook what they can do. The rest of the team, one that's almost somewhat interesting, I don't think it's going to happen, but another team that almost feels like it's sneaky dangerous because you can never overlook them is BYU. BYU is not the BYU we've known of the last few years. They are not that perennial NCAA tournament team. This is a team that's going to barely scratch the NIT if they even get in there. But if you look at all of their games, even though they ended up in 5th place and they're 7-9, a lot of those 9 losses are by single digits.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a chance that if they finally put things together and Rudy Williams, the transfer from Coastal Carolina, really gets on a run, maybe it's BYU. And then the one I didn't even mention at all was Santa Clara, who, and I don't know if it would be a surprise run for them because they've been so good all year. And they have arguably one of the other player of the year candidates in Brandon Pajemski.
Mm-hmm.
That's a Santa Clara team that, because they have 2 guys who can light it up, are always dangerous. I still don't know if any of them are going to get by St. Mary's or Gonzaga, because they still have, and that's always the challenge in the league. And you know this, you don't have to beat one of them. You have to beat both of them. And doing that in back-to-back days is a tough task for anybody.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like, speaking of those star players, are there other individuals we should be keeping an eye out for who are not on the St. Mary's or Gonzaga team?
Yeah, mentioned a few of them. Pajemski and Shelton, I think, are like 1 and 1, like 1A, 1B when it comes to that list of guys you have to watch out for. But I mean, someone who has been on a heater the last few weeks and someone who we can't overlook, because especially now it's his final year, his final tournament, is Khalil Shabazz. I mean, He's been so good in this league for so long. He came back to USF when he didn't have to. There were opportunities. He is about as dangerous and a guy who knows how to rise to the moment, rise to the occasion like few others in the league. And this is, again, his last WCC tournament. It would not surprise me that he put on a show this coming week. Another guy, I think, less so, but I think someone to also keep an eye out for is, I'm going to say Moses Wood with Portland. Moses Wood is also another guy who, when he gets going, can take over a game. Like he's one of the keys when Portland is rolling, Moses Wood is rolling. And as much as like it's all focused around Tyler Robertson for that team, and he is kind of like their everyman, he's the ball handler and everything else, they are a different team when Moses Wood is going. So I think like those are a couple other guys that if I'm going to point at guys maybe toward the bottom of the league who might make a run or you're going to have to really pay attention to, it's Shabazz and Moses Wood.
So they could do some damage for the teams that may be going further in the tournament.
Potentially. USF is maybe one of the more confusing teams, or maybe not confusing, but like they're maybe one of the more frustrating teams.
Yeah.
Because when they are so dependent upon how they shoot the three, and when they're on, look out. But when they are off, it could be a disaster.
Right. I feel that way about USF all the time, that they have so much potential and then they surprisingly don't come up to the top.
That's been a lot of the case this year. I mean, last year was everything working exactly the way it was supposed to. Like, that's USF when everything goes to plan. This year is almost USF when nothing goes to plan. Now, all that said, USF still has won 18 games, and they could still get to 20 this year, which, grand scheme of things, like the fact that you could say everything went wrong and they didn't play well, they didn't play up to their potential, they might still win 20 games, which I think that says something about where that program has grown. Because again, a year ago they won, I think it was 25 games, 26 games, and that was a tournament team. That's a difference of just like 4 or 5 games, and they were a tournament team. Then again, like, I'm not saying like this USF team is as talented as the one a year ago. They're not. They don't rebound the ball well. They're small. They're undersized. Their offense is too inconsistent and too reliant upon the three that I don't think they can make a run in the tournament. Can they win a game? Absolutely. But it would be hard pressed for me to think that they could make it to, say, Monday in the tournament.
Are there any injuries any of the teams have right now we should know about?
Nothing. I would say nothing on the serious front. A lot of the injuries actually belong to teams at the bottom. Portland has been ravaged by injuries all year long. That's a big reason why they've been so inconsistent. They're a little healthier now. Mike Meadows has been back the last few games. He missed a good chunk of the season, which when you're without your point guard, that hurts. And so that was a big blow. They were being without Chris Austin all year long. So this was going to be a struggle for Portland. You can point to San Diego. San Diego has been without the 2 big transfers that they got in the offseason, Eric Williams Jr. and then also Jaden Dallaire. Like, they've been out without both of them since the beginning of February. And I don't know if that was going to make much of a difference for San Diego, but at least like it hurt their depth at the very least. And Eric Williams was leading the league in rebounding at almost 9.5 a game. So there's impact there in a number of ways. But USF has also been without Julian Rishwain for a good chunk of the year. He's out for the year. Like, that's a wrap for him. BYU is just not really much there. So I don't want to. This isn't the top teams. The teams you expected are going to be in the mix. Oh, no, I do remember. LMU actually has a few guys that are banged up. So this is another team that, like, the last few years they've battled injuries, but they have key guys. Justin Arns did not play on Saturday. They've had some injury issues with Rick Asanza, who's their center. They've had guys in and out of the lineup. So health is a big part of LMU's success going into the tournament. And a lot of it is going to be TBD as we get closer to their games to see who's in, who's out. And if they're healthy, the better chance they have.
Okay. What do you think is going to be like the most interesting matchups then coming into this?
And I was talking about a little bit in the pod before I got you on that looking at the bracket, it's weirdly dangerous on the 1 seed side of the bracket. Because if you're St. Mary's sitting as the 1 seed, the line of teams that you potentially face are Portland, BYU, or LMU. The 3, maybe for St. Mary's, the 3 most dangerous of the non-Gonzaga teams, because those are teams that can frustrate St. Mary's in different ways. Like, BYU and LMU are good defensive teams, and we've seen it against both those teams that St. Mary's will have long droughts without scoring. And BYU has gotten close twice, couldn't close the deal. And LMU closed out the deal once already. So, and it's the most recent game. So, like, I feel like the most interesting matchup, if you're going to say that, is going to be what happens on that side of the bracket. And obviously I don't have specific matchups yet because we got to play them out.
Mm-hmm.
The other one I think that will be really fascinating to see is potentially round 3 of USF Santa Clara. Santa Clara swept USF for the first time in a long time this year. And it's hard to beat a team 3 times, especially when you're not Gonzaga. And I think Santa Clara is playing really well right now. I think that they're the outside of Gonzaga, they're the hottest team in the WCC at the moment. And I think it'll be fascinating to see if we get USF Santa Clara again, if Santa Clara can get the complete sweep of the Dons.
Really? Wow. Huh. So I think it's funny that you mentioned BYU as being like able to make a run for it or have an interesting, dangerous match, because I feel like that school came into the conference with so much swagger. They thought they were going to come in and steamroll absolutely everyone and be the kings of the conference, and not once have they gotten the title. And you know, it seems like they're going to be leaving with their tails behind their legs. So can you say a little more about, like, you know, what their potential was coming in and how that kind of fizzled for them?
I mean, they came into the WCC on an absolute high. The last year before they came into the WCC was the end of the Jimmer Fredette era. Oh, yeah. So they were as high as they possibly could be coming off of that run, that team, coming into the WCC. They were still really good. They had a lot of really good players on that team. Brandon Davies comes to mind. Throughout the years, you had the Matt Carlinos. Everyone's favorite guy to hate, Nick Emery, was on those teams. Fus Traore, the most recent addition. But if we can talk about, and now I'm blanking on his name, their point guard a year ago. But this, I think what happened was, so I think there's a cultural change when it comes to like how the coaching changed. So Dave Rose was obviously their head coach from the time they entered until about 4 years ago. And I think that most everyone would have agreed that it was time to move on, that BYU had kind of hit a wall and needed a fresh start, needed a new face in the building. And I think that obviously like Dave Rose's health actually played a big factor in that. I think the fact that he was having some health issues toward the end of that run kind of forced BYU's hand and forced Dave Rose's hand to kind of like say it's time to split. But I think also the WCC kind of caught up to BYU. And I mean the rest of the WCC caught up to BYU. Because while Gonzaga and St. Mary's continued to be Gonzaga and St. Mary's, the rest of the league wasn't beating St. Mary's. The rest of the league figured out how to beat BYU. And it did look like they were having a harder time recruiting. I think that at times the timing of the missions that some of their players would go on did not help them. Mm-hmm. There were some guys who probably would have really helped them, like say a year or two ago. Dallin Hall is probably a good example of that. This year, he's a freshman this year, but he was on mission the last couple of years. They probably could have used him the last couple of years to really kind of like get that experience and everything else. And then he would have come back a little bit more experienced after Alex Barcelo left. And I now remember his name. They might've been in a better position going into this year. Maybe not. Who knows? But it also, I think there's also been a lot of talk about whether Mark Pope was actually the right answer as the coach. He had a great first couple of years as the head coach at BYU. He took Dave Rose's players, he built them up, got them to not only one NCAA tournament, but would have been in a second had the pandemic not happened. But then at that stage, it started to turn. And it's not like BYU was like getting blown out by teams, but they were no longer winning the games that you think they were going to win.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the league seemed to have put the pieces together more often against them. USF was better. Santa Clara was better. Pepperdine was better. LMU has been better the last few years. They had a down year last year, but 2 of the last 3, they've been good. You look at even teams like Portland. Portland has a resurgence last year. You have teams like Pacific, who through the Damon Stoudemire years, yes, they were down last year, but then this year they're kind of right back in it. So now I know Pacific didn't beat BYU this year, so that's maybe not a great example, but teams caught up. And and BYU was no longer able to beat St. Mary's and Gonzaga. And that's, I think, partly the difference. I do wonder how much of the shadow of the Big 12 also impacted that. And knowing that they were jumping leagues, and the WCC teams knowing they were going and wanted to have a little more oomph. I don't know if any one of them would actually admit to that being the case, that they knew they were leaving, so they added a little extra.
A little kick on the way out.
Right. I don't know if they would ever actually admit that publicly. Privately, they might say like, "Oh yeah, like we wanted to show them the door."
I'm sure all fan bases will say that about them.
No, the fan bases definitely. I'm saying like the players. I don't know if the players would actually admit to that. It's like, oh, we play hard against everybody, but you probably play a little harder against BYU. But yeah, it's such a curious case. I think going in the Big 12, it's gonna be a rude awakening for them. I mean, you take one look at the net; they would be the last team in the Big 12, the new Big 12. They would be team 12 of 12 in that league. So we'll see. There's going to be a lot of turnover on that team. If they can recruit better, they have a chance. But it's not easy to recruit to BYU. Mm-hmm. And I think that's more than anything has been the biggest problem over the last few years.
Yeah. And I feel like, them coming in with so much swagger into our conference and being fed humble pie, it's become even more and more apparent.
Yeah.
But like that whole shuffle in the middle of the conference, like I'm not sure I'm any clear on who to bet on.
I mean, probably the safest bet is probably going to, if we're going to safe bet, is probably Santa Clara. Santa Clara is probably the safest bet because they separated themselves from the rest of that pack. Now, the only hesitation on that is the fact that they can win their first game, but then they'll get Gonzaga. So you kind of take that for what it might be. They have been the best team outside of St. Mary's and Gonzaga all year long. They're playing definitely that way in the last month. They have the best win outside of what St. Mary's and Gonzaga have done. They beat Boise State back in December, and I think Boise State is still like a top 25 KenPom team. So they own the best win. Well, pause, LMU 2 top 10 wins because Gonzaga, St. Mary's. But non-conference wins. Santa Clara is dangerous. They have 2 guys who can take over a game. If there's a safe bet, it's Santa Clara.
Mm-hmm. The safest bet I like to take, and it's my last question, is which matchup can I take a nap through? I need a break from all the games sometimes.
Oh, which game can you take a nap in? It's probably the first round matchup. Pacific and Pepperdine. That's probably the one. Because even I think at least San Diego, and Portland could light up the scoreboard. I just feel like Pacific and Pepperdine is going to be the ugliest of the games. I think that's the best way to put it. I think that's going to be the ugliest of the games. So that might be the one to break out the Kindle, read a book, and and casually like take a peek, but that's about it for that game.
Okay. Any other easy bets to take?
No. This, again, we talk about the jumble in the middle. This tournament will be as chaotic as it has, as the WCC season has played out all year long. I mean, maybe the safest, if any, bet is Gonzaga St. Mary's in the final, that those two will be there. But if this year has told us anything, is that even Gonzaga and St. Mary's can be had.
Yeah.
And I know only one team has actually done it outside of each other, but it seems like if there was a year for it to happen, this would be the year for it to happen. Although I would say that it not being them is probably like a 5% chance that it's not those two.
All right.
All right. Well, for those of you who are listening, so here was your little tutorial on the WCC tournament. Thanks, Linda, for helping out with those questions. I know that you're paying attention somewhat to what's happening, but now it's the time of year to really dive in. Going to be a crazy weekend, crazy time in Vegas, and March is finally here. As I've said, I think this tournament is just going to be absolute chaos. It's going to be real hard for me to think that someone's going to pull away in this tournament. Santa Clara's played really well. I think that they're the hottest team outside of Gonzaga, so they're maybe probably one of the safer bets. Everyone else we know can lose to everyone else. I think it'll be really entertaining to see. I do think that there are some of those games going to have at least a little less entertainment value. And it'll be really interesting to see who gets to Monday, who gets to Gonzaga, who gets to St. Mary's. And I do think, grand scheme of things, next Tuesday will be Gonzaga St. Mary's for the title. It will be round 3 between these two. The matchup between them was really the same game all over again, at least in the way it went early on. Gonzaga played really well defensively. St. Mary's couldn't do anything offensively. They got down big in the first half. And then in the second half, they crawled their way back into that game. They figured out a way. Aiden Mahaney started to make a run, but it was squashed out. Gonzaga got enough stops late, got enough stops there in that second half to keep St. Mary's at bay. And Anton Watson, again, I've mentioned this already, was great the other night. And they did all of this without getting much from Julian Strother, who had a terrible game. And I'm sure he would admit that was a terrible game for him. St. Mary's got nothing from Mitchell Saxon. He was in foul trouble most of the night. You didn't get you got very little from anyone outside of Logan Johnson on a consistent basis. Joshua Jefferson had a great game. Speaking of not much from anyone else, but Joshua Jefferson really played well in that game. Gave St. Mary's a pretty sizable boost there in the second half, playing in lieu of Saxon. He's going to be, I think he'll be a key contributor down the road. Maybe we see him a little bit more in the WCC tournament. I think he'll play a factor in the NCAA tournament at some point. What that looks like, we'll see. So I'm excited the fact that we're already here. Vegas is here. The WCC tournament has finally arrived. I think we're going to, if I'm going to pick it, who ends up seeing St. Mary's and who ends up seeing Gonzaga, I think it's going to be Santa Clara Gonzaga next Monday night. And then I think the matchup with St. Mary's, I'm going to pick BYU to pull the upset and be that 5 to make the mini run to see St. Mary's one more time in Vegas. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to follow on YouTube. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at PostByZach, and also on TikTok at PostByZach. And also be sure to share and everything else, all the things, yada, yada, yada. For those of you who are coming to Vegas, I will be in Vegas. Hope to see you all there. And until next week, I have a good week, and I will catch you later.